Hello and welcome to the Last Week in Denmark podcast, where each week we talk through some of the top stories that happened last week in Denmark. We focus on how they impact internationals living here. So if that sounds like you, then as always, welcome home. You're in the right place and we're so glad to have you here. If you're a first-time listener, you should know that we have 4 full seasons under our belt, ready for you to explore, and we have new episodes launching every week during this, which is season 5. I'm Fionn and Katie, and joining me this week for episode 15 of season 5 is my wonderful co-host, Katie Burns. Hiya, Katie.
Hi, Fionn.
And I'm really pleased to announce that we're also joined this week by a very special guest, who is none other than author and podcaster Kay Xander Mellish. Kay is the voice behind How to Live in Denmark podcast, Denmark's longest running English language podcast, and she's also the author of the new book, The Danish Year, 12 Months of Customs, Quirks, and Rhythms of Everyday Life. Kay, it is absolutely wonderful to have you on the pod.
So fun to be here. I'm so happy to get the invitation.
Brilliant. Well, every week we explore a few topics, and this week we're going to be looking at what could become the next big shift in how driving is taxed. We'll look at whether proposals from the Liberal Alliance Party could make it easier to turn cowsheds into conference halls. And finally, we're going to be looking at shifting attitudes around some cultural taboos in Denmark. Before we get going, though, we'd love to just ask you one thing. If what we're talking about resonates with you this week, please share this podcast with somebody that you know. We're here to help internationals in Denmark stay informed and feel connected. So thanks a million for helping us reach more people who are just like you. Now, I'm going to mess this up and I apologize, but Kay and Katie, it is brilliant to have you both here and I'm really looking forward to chatting. But how are you guys doing? I feel like it's finally spring, right?
It's spring and it's absolutely wonderful.
Oh my God, there's sunshine. You can see it in people. People are kinder. There's more people outside. Everyone wants to exercise. I don't, but I appreciate the people do. It's such a shift. It's so nice. But actually, it is horribly windy in Aarhus today.
Also here in Copenhagen, I was taking my son to judo earlier, and as maybe a spoiler for one of the first topics we're going to talk about, I don't own a car, so we have one of those, the cargo bikes that you put kids in and you put a little tent over them and look very smug that you're doing your place for the environment. But that little tent basically acts like a sail. And I was struggling to get above 10 kilometers an hour, and it was very embarrassing as children on their non-e-bikes were going past me. So yeah, I mean, just the other weekend, I saw the first swallow arriving into Denmark, and that made me feel like it's summer. And then the wind kind of knocked me for 6. So it's still Denmark.
It might have killed the swallow as well. It's very intense at the moment. Just like a boom.
I hope not. It would be a pretty big shame if they made it all the way up from Africa only to get knocked out by the wind on Amar. But with all that said, we should probably dive into the topics that we have this week. And the first topic we're going to look at is the new Danish word, I think, actually, that we can give to our listeners as a Danish word of the week this week. And that is vejafgifter, which is road pricing or road taxing. And really, this is a story about the price it costs to drive a passenger car in Denmark, and some new discussions or proposals and tests, actually, or trials, you could say, that have been carried out to look at, instead of just paying taxes through fuel and registration fees or fixed charges, how drivers could actually pay more based on when and how much they drive. Now, obviously, there's a lot to this story, but I was curious, have either of you come across this researching for the podcast this week? Has it popped up in your lives already? As a non-car owner, this was news to me.
Like you, Fionn, I have a driver's license, but I have never owned a car. I love to drive in the U.S. where you have those big open roads through the desert and that sort of thing. But in Denmark, I don't think it's fun to drive. The bicyclists are always like the little mosquitoes. They're coming from all different directions. Here, I'm the bicyclist, and cars are just an annoyance. But I don't like this idea for the law because, let's face it, some people need a car. Old people, disabled people, people with small children, people who use big equipment in their work. I live next door to a hospital, and they were suggesting recently that people should take the bus to the hospital. That's okay for a blood test, but if I'm sick, I want to be in a car or maybe an ambulance.
Yeah, depending on how sick, right?
Yeah.
I understand that completely. We have 2 small kids. We had a car. The car did not like being a car anymore. So we got rid of it a few years ago, and generally it's been fine. We live in suburban Copenhagen, right? We live beside a metro, we live beside a train station, we have bus routes. We're really lucky in that regard. But 3 years ago, my daughter was being born and she was to be delivered in Villa Hospital. And that meant taxis back and forth. It would have been taken nearly an hour and a half, 2 hours by public transport. Generally, I'm very, very pro taking cars off the road where we can. But I do think that there are many people for whom it is less of an option than it is for me. And there's many people, especially outside of major cities. And you don't have to go that far outside of major cities where the public transport that you would hope is a viable alternative just isn't there.
Yes, coming in from Aarhus. I think often when they bring in these things about car taxes and how do we charge people, it's kind of making us be more conscious of how much we're driving, or how do we make sure we're being, reasonable in terms of we can take the bus, we can take the metro. But this feels more like making being able to drive something only the rich can do. No one is going like, God, I'd love to sit in a car for an hour. They're doing it because they have to. Aarhus is a major city. We're the second biggest city in Denmark, but our public transport is horrendous. I refuse to take it wherever I don't have to. I have a reputation within my friends that I walk everywhere, because if it's less than an hour, I will walk because I hate the bus. My partner is a teacher. She teaches in two places. One is Runda, which is about a 25-minute drive from where we live, and the other is Ranners, which is similar, 25-minute drive, but in the other direction. She has to leave 3 hours early because either the bus or train will be late. Because of the timings of her classes versus the timings when the buses should arrive, she basically has to plan her whole day to make it in for one class to then teach that one class because it's so unreliable. I did not realize how bad the bus was, because in Dublin, the bus is horrendous also. But once I heard about someone who had to use it every day for work, still mad about it. But she uses it every day to get to work, and it's so unreliable. I can't imagine if, again, you needed to get to a hospital. It's like, we could go with a taxi, because who knows if the bus is even going to be there.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's fine for a blood test or a mammogram, isn't it? But if you need to be at the hospital urgently, you're going to want a car.
That's my partner is pregnant at the moment. She's due in August. And that's a big question for us, is how do we get the baby home? And then we're like, okay, we live in Aarhus, which we got in when it was a construction site, but it's become very expensive. And basically, if we had a car, which, yes, it would be convenient, we don't really need one, but even just to rent it so that we know, for the month when she's due, we'd have that comfort of being able to get in and out of the car. It would cost as much as our rent to get a parking space to be able to have it. So it's just not an option for us. But then if we want to get the bus and be good citizens, we have to get a bus to the hospital and hope it lets us off near the right exit, because our hospital is so huge that it has different branches. You have a bus that goes to number 14 and then another bus that goes to number 12 because they're so far away. So it's just there's no room for error, and we're all stressed and terrified and trying to figure out what to do with the baby. The only option is a taxi then. So in those kind of cases, I'm like, so now if I had a car to just feel comfort and safe in being able to take my partner to have her baby, which we need babies, there's a birth decline. I need to pay for the parking space. I need to pay for the car. I need to pay for the car insurance, but I also need to pay for the kilometers to the hospital. That's insanity.
Yeah. I think we've all had quite, I don't want to say emotional reactions, but I think all of our reactions have come from places of feeling. And I don't mean to subtract from the validity at all. I think all of these things you're saying are completely valid. And a huge part of it is the security, right? Whether it's the security of being able to get to work on time, or knowing that your entire day isn't going to be dominated by one missed bus because public transport isn't reliable. Or exactly as you mentioned, and I feel this completely as well, the idea of, moving around with stressful situations like healthcare or like pregnancy or taking a baby home. And I've experienced that, and it's going to be stressful no matter what. So adding in unreliable public transport to that is nightmarish. I'd love to take it back to the actual study for a second, because this study was carried out by DTU and Sun and Belt, and they did find this actually did reduce traffic quite a lot. In the biggest city center zones, traffic fell by between 12 and 22%. And in suburban zones, it was a bit less, which you might expect, but it was between 7 and 11%. And charges during rush hour times had a much stronger effect. So the hope is that this would reduce congestion. And you could argue maybe this is attractive for a few reasons. Traffic is not evenly distributed So maybe the fact that you're taking more cars off the road makes the buses more reliable. That could be an angle that you look at it that way. But what I thought was quite interesting was the amount of pushback that came from mayors of different comunas. And many of them are what you would call more like suburban comunas rather than really rural comunas. Because I don't think anybody could rightly argue that if you live in rural Denmark, there's absolutely no need for a car ever. You can just take public transport anywhere. I think anybody who's been in rural Denmark will quite clearly tell you that that's just not the case. But they were mayors like Dower Kommune, Villor Kommune. So these are part of Greater Copenhagen, but they're obviously not exposed in the same way to just how tight the kind of web of S trains and metros are when you're in the city centre. And I thought what was interesting was how much the reactions across political parties actually ended up being quite similar, which is like there's a kernel of a really good idea in here, but the infrastructure needs to be in place for example, people in Villor Kommune to come and, drop, or maybe they're coming from further out. But if a metro goes to Villor Hospital, for example, well, they need to be able to drop their car somewhere so that they can then take the metro. And that does mean actually building parking spaces for a kind of park and ride model, which just aren't there today. So I think obviously we can have emotive reactions or feelings about this. And I think I don't say emotive to mean that they're not as valid as a logical reaction, to put it that way. But I think there is just such a disconnect is the right word, but putting the cart before the horse, if we can say it that way. Whereas there is, I think, a lot of benefits and a lot of good ideas to doing something like this, but we need to make sure it actually works for people rather than for a statistic on, yes, we reduce traffic in this test.
I do see, though, a big difference between you're obviously in Copenhagen, and I see it working really, like it could work really well. And like that, with obviously some investment in infrastructure, like in the where they just are like, there needs to be a car park so that the neighborhoods don't become a car park. But in Aarhus or Odense, because like there's just so much that would need to be done, it's not realistic anytime soon for those big but still smaller cities.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. I was in Aarhus quite recently on 2 occasions, and on one occasion we were off visiting friends a little bit outside of Aarhus, and they were lucky enough to live on the Letbane, so it was really easy. And then we were visiting some family who I would feel like they live in the equivalent area that I live, right, for Copenhagen, so not very far outside, but it was taking a bus and then another bus and then walking for 20 minutes. I think if that doesn't raise the question that, is this kind of the future of Danish transport or just a policy that kind of sounds clever until you think about it a little bit deeper? I don't know what is.
I think Danish people like their cars. I disagree with Katie. She said nobody wants to be stuck in traffic. I think a lot of people like their cars, particularly in Newland. Yeah, I think they get a lot of joy out of driving. And for some people with busy lives, that is their only time all day they can be alone. I think they enjoy that time.
It's interesting. I never thought of that.
That's a fair point. I have to say there's times when I enjoy a longer commute than a shorter one because it is my chance to read a book or listen to a podcast, such as an award-winning Last Week in Denmark podcast. Just to throw that out there. But I think we've all have strong feelings about this, but I think we're all kind of leaning in the same direction. So maybe it's time that we look at one of our other topics this week. And I think, the idea of drivers versus not drivers, that's a story we saw a lot in Denmark, particularly around the local elections. If you were looking at Copenhagen or some of those municipalities, it really, really played out. And I think our next topic is also kind of a very Danish story. At the heart of it, it is about a farmer called Anders Kolgaard from Lemvig, who wants to transform some former cowsheds on his family farm and some other facilities as well into things like I wouldn't say a conference center, but a conference hall or an event space. He also wants to open up ceramics workshops and essentially transform what has been purely an agricultural location into something that maybe has multi-purposes and could tap into a tourist market. And I think on paper, that sounds like a very clever reuse that will say like, okay, let's take an old rural building, give it new life, bring people into the countryside. But the story and the challenge is that there are planning laws that can make these kind of changes much more difficult in Denmark than, for example, just across the pond in Sweden. What do you guys think about this? Is this another urban-rural divide that is overplayed, or is this a real issue in rural Denmark?
I have no problem with making these conversions. I'm a keynote speaker, and I frequently go to these conference centers. It's a place to get out of the office and maybe spend 2 or 3 days together talking about business problems. I think it's very refreshing for people. And quite frankly, a lot of rural Denmark is poor. We're not talking about taking agricultural land away. We're talking about converting buildings to conference centers. I think it's a great idea for both the locality and to get more people from the cities into the countryside.
Yeah, I don't see any downside to this. I obviously understand the fears that maybe this would make people move away from farming, but if it's not working as a farm, isn't it great that they have another option to do something else? And like that, people are obsessed with the idea of a sommerhus. So like this is just the same, but for businesses to go, like wedding venues, or like in the article about ceramic kind of workshops in the middle of the countryside. Like that sounds adorable. I was like looking up the names to be like, when is this going to happen? When will it be announced? And also, I love how Danish it is that they're like, well, they could do it in Sweden, so why can't we do it here? And it's like, it's a really good point. I think this has happened a lot throughout Ireland as well, and what it's kind of come out of it is very contained places. So you can have a wedding venue, but everything is in the one place. So the wedding happens in that place, everyone can stay in that place, because farms are huge properties, and you can make them look and match the world that's around them. So you have this beautiful countryside retreat where everyone can go and everyone can stay there. Similar with kind of a corporate retreat of, instead of going for a workation where everyone is drinking for 3 days in a cabin, like go to one of these lovely places and do ceramics together. That would free up your brain so much more. And I feel like Danish people would be so into it.
Did you know that the Last Week in Denmark newsletter is available in 8 languages? Hey there, this is Fionn from the Last Week in Denmark podcast, and every week you guys are tuning in to hear me and my fellow co-hosts talk about the top news of the week in English. But let's be real, we're all internationals, so not only are you speaking English every day, you're probably also speaking a bit of Danish, but you've probably also got your own native language as well, like the multilingual master you are. So why not treat yourself to the luxury of being able to read Danish news each week in your own native language? So head on over to lastweekdk.substack.com, that's lastweekdk.substack.com, and sign up for our newsletter delivered to you every single Sunday.
Yeah, I think on the face of it, I generally agree. I think if you've lived in Denmark or read much about Denmark, you've probably heard the term the rotten banana, and that is that stretch of Denmark that goes generally down the west coast into sunny Jylland and kind of across the southern islands as well. And it's not a particularly nice term, and I'm sure residents there aren't fond of it, but it does lie in contrast to the whiskey belt, right, which sits north of Copenhagen, and well, you can kind of guess which one is the rich one or which one is the poor one. And this is definitely, I don't think, a Danish issue solely. I think there are many countries that are kind of having a struggle around rural life and how rural life is transforming. And many of the traditional aspects of rural life are disappearing, and people don't necessarily want them to. And I think it is important that we enable people to live a rural life rather than just saying, well, move to the city and let farms be taken over by one huge corporation. The one question that I'd maybe put with this is it a risk that if we make it too easy, the countryside slowly kind of turns into a patchwork of holiday rentals and small businesses and event venues, and the actual, I don't want to say necessarily the genuine nature of the Danish rural spirit or, actual farming kind of gets worn away?
I don't know. I think that's rather unfair to the people who live there. Like, stay cute so we can visit you. I don't go for that. So you were talking about real property right now. If I had money right now, I don't. I would be buying property on Falster and on Lowland, because that tunnel from Denmark to Germany is opening in 2030. There's going to be a lot of traffic through there, not just Danish, but Swedish. It ends at Rådbyhaven. There's going to be a lot of Germans coming up. There's going to be a lot of Swedes and Danes coming through. Look what happened to Malmö when the Öresund Bridge opened. It totally blossomed.
Exactly.
It totally blossomed. I think there's people interested in investing in these areas, which right now are, quite frankly, very poor.
Yeah. So I have family living in rural Denmark, obviously the in-laws rather than my own. But one thing that I've really noticed, which has been, I think, a very interesting change, is obviously if you look at property prices there and you look at property prices in the bigger Danish cities, it's not even like a linear progression. It seems to be like exponentially more to buy in a city. Traditionally, you've had a lot of seasonal workers who've come. And I've seen a shift in some of the towns that they live in, where you've had people coming in to work on farms over the summers, coming typically from Eastern Europe, but they are actually settling in many of these places now, having saved up money. Often some of them have transitioned into working in their retirement homes, because a lot of these towns are also, they would have a much older age profile as well. And they're actually buying up some of this cheap property. And to me, that's a wonderful way of actually, rather than just treating a group of internationals as, okay, they're seasonal workers, but they can't necessarily make a home or a life here, actually seeing that revitalizing communities. And I think you're absolutely right about some of these projects, like the bridge and tunnel to Germany. They will have similar revitalizing effects as well. One thing that I thought was kind of interesting from the political aspect of this is that Liberal Alliance have kind of been championing this story and pushing for further changes and loosening of the rules, kind of as a freedom to grow argument. But I did notice that it was actually only in late 2024 that there were changes made to the Planning Act. And this was done with the government parties at the time, but also with support by the Conservatives. I believe it was Dansk Folkeparti as well. And Liberal Alliance actually supported many of the aspects of these changes. And these feel like already address much of their story around this issue. So actually providing more freedom for local and urban rural development, so that, yeah, there's more freedom to do actually exactly as we've been talking. Also to establish more summer houses in coastal areas and provide more and better opportunities to use redundant buildings for tourism purposes. So maybe it hasn't gone far enough, but I do somehow question, after we've just had these changes kind of being discussed and being brought in, that is this also a case of maybe a political party trying to point score with voters?
Yes, that would be very unusual for a political party to try to point score with voters. They don't do that.
It would, right?
I'm most interested in the fact that the Liberal Alliance is one of their, they've got they call it the conservative boy band of, I think it's 4 young guys who just got elected. One of them confessed on a podcast this week that he dyes his hair blonde. He's like 25. He dyes his hair blonde because he thinks it makes him look better. And he does look great. But I think it's very bold of him to confess this. And it was the guy from Liberal Alliance, Mestrange.
They're competing with the Bonus Party for political scandals, right? And maybe this brings them into the news. And with that, I think we can start to move towards the final topic for today. And in the words of the great American Benjamin Franklin to the great Frenchman Jean-Baptiste Leroy, in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. And I feel like that brings us pretty much towards what we're going to talk about, which isn't in fact death and taxes, but it is talking about death and talking about salaries. So that is the best transition that I could come up with. And there's kind of a number of stories that I think on the face of them maybe are quite different, but there is a red thread between them. There have been some stories this week or are kind of coming out around the rise in interest in something called death doulas in Denmark. And we can touch on that, I think, what that is in a moment. But also the challenge that many people have in terms of discussing money and salaries. And I think in both of these the articles, if you read them, they talk a little bit about, cultural shifts. And yeah, I think these are two things that many people find very difficult to discuss or confront. I'd love to kind of hear from either of you, do we think in Denmark, are we good at talking about these things? Or are these some taboos that we just tend to avoid until we absolutely have to discuss them?
I would not say Danish people are good at talking in general. I think you really kind of have to pull it out of them in the first place. I was surprised. I think I expected Denmark, because they seem more chill and kind of like progressive. I was really surprised about the salary, but that's still a thing of like, people don't really talk about their salaries. But you definitely like sense that same awkwardness that I think you get anywhere else talking about salaries. Similarly with death, I don't feel like they are, even though they work so much on kind of emotional maturity. And in schools, there's so much topic of like, let's discuss these themes, let's really understand them, and really like helping at all ages that they process their emotions and kind of grow up to be healthy human beings. I find a lot of Danish people I meet shut down conversations about death because they're too scared to confront it. That's normal. I think that's a global thing. But I think it's so, so important that we have these conversations for so many reasons. This came up in work for some reason this week. But one of my colleagues, her mother passed or died. Actually, that's another topic of what words do we use. So, you say passed because we don't want to say died. But she did die a year ago. And basically her mother had cancer. Her mother was told that the cancer spread and that it wasn't going to get better. And the mother made the decision not to tell her or her siblings how sick she was. And obviously she wanted to protect them, but they didn't find out how sick she was until afterwards. And we kind of had the discussion of like, you can see where the mother was coming with the best of intentions and not wanting to drag everybody down with her and making it her own burden. But she took away the chance for her children to, first of all, emotionally process what's actually happening and prepare for when she was going to die. But it also meant they missed the chance for all those important questions of what do you want your legacy to be? How do we make you as comfortable as possible when you're ready to go and die? What do you want that to look like? But also what happens in terms of inheritance. She has multiple children. If she has anything to leave behind, they now have to deal with that on top of their mother suddenly dying. And I feel like those are the conversations where a death doula is so, so important because it's such a big thing that everybody is going to experience at some point, but we never get any tools to be able to kind of deal with it or even to comfort our friends and family when it happens to them. I've had a big loss in my life as well. And the amount of stupid shit that people said at the funeral, and it was just like, I didn't hold it against anybody because I did the same. I said all the same stupid things. I'm so sorry. Isn't it so wonderful that you had such a wonderful time with them before? It's all terrible. And then you're like, I want to check in with you, but I don't want to remind you that someone has died. But obviously, if you lose someone close to you, you think about them every single day. So it's a very strange, and actually, I actually think in Harry Potter, there's a really good representation of this. I don't remember the name of the creature. I'm not a big fan. I'm so sorry. But in, I think, the 5th movie, there's a creature that you can only see if you've been around death, or you've seen someone die. And I think there's something to that, that only when you lose someone do you see how insane it is that we have no tools, no talks, no discussion about what is important with death, what are the important conversations, what are the important ways to take care of yourself. I went to actually a special therapist. It was after my brother died, and his one job was to make sure I didn't ruin my life, because for the first year after you lose someone, it's really tempting to do impulsive behavior. So whether that's to move country again, change job, end a relationship, anything like that. So his one job was to be like, stay calm. Do not do anything insane. And honestly, it was the most helpful therapy I've had in a long time.
That's fascinating. I obviously familiar with the concept of therapy, but not necessarily in that kind of specific role, but it makes a lot of sense. Kay, I think you've written a book about it, right? You're something of an expert in, Danish customs and culture. Before reading this article, had you heard of the term death doula? Where do you think it kind of fits into Danish society?
I have never heard of the term death doula, and my favorite Danish expression for death is he set aside his wooden shoes. So my father set aside his wooden shoes. When I set aside my wooden shoes, I hope this will happen. Katie has, I think, a different circle than me. I live across the street from a hospice, so I see people on their final days all the time. And I see their relatives taking them out for what might be their last chance for some sunshine or some last chance to hear the birds. One thing that I really like about this particular hospice is it's in an old building and the windows open. I went to a planning meeting for a new hospital and all the windows were glued closed. This was right before COVID. I think now they have a little thing. But I said to the architect, you need to be able to open the window. This could be the end for somebody. They want some fresh air. They want to hear the birds. They want to feel the sunshine. And he was like, well, we've got a very good HVAC system. We have good air conditioning. No, it's not the same. When you're in your final moments, you want the best the world has to offer, which is nature.
Absolutely right. And maybe his comment is almost a testament to why this is becoming a trend, right? Many years ago, in another lifetime almost, I studied archaeology and ancient civilizations. And one thing that really stuck out to me is just how early it was, as early humans, we began burying people and actually having some form of funeral. And what I thought was really interesting was the amount of work that ancient people put into funerals, put into decorating graves. Well, one of the reasons, of course, for this is that a funeral is not actually for the dead person. It is for the living who remain. A very grim sentence, but it is for those who come after them and remain after them. And a funeral, typically, right, it's obviously now we do it in different ways, but there are typically some quite standardized processes that you go through with it. And it is ultimately kind of a set of cues for those who remain to reorient themselves, to understand what is my place now in the family, right? When this person is gone. How can I start working through some of those emotions, for example, and giving kind of a gateway or stages to do that? And obviously, it's not the only part of that process, but it is a process that I've endured, right, for hundreds of thousands of years. And it's really was playing on my mind when I read this article, because this is maybe taking the process a little bit earlier and later, and I think that's a really good thing. And there are questions that are kind of raised around this as well, in terms of it's not necessarily a regulated area. So right now, maybe anybody can call themselves a death doula. Should this be something that's regulated? Should it be something that is left to a hospice or, trained nurses? But ultimately, I think the idea actually that we have people in society who are more dedicated, or more people maybe who are dedicated, that's a better way of putting it, for helping us navigate the process of death, because it is, as Katie said, a process that we will all go through. And understanding, well, what actually does the person who is at the center of it want as well? What is really important to them? And as you mentioned, Kate, that could be hearing the birdsong, right, on your last day, could be such a comfort to somebody. And actually having somebody that can help take those frank discussions, and I think, be part of that process, but still somehow a little bit aside from that process. They are not a direct family member. They'll probably grieve that person, but not in the same way. And maybe that's a bit easier also for the person who is to say things, right, to them. They know that that person doesn't have the a skin in the game, in the will, or anything like that as well. So I think it's a really interesting trend that we're seeing. And yeah, maybe it does mark a cultural shift in Denmark.
Just want to make the quick point, Fionn, that the Red Cross does have a service to have someone with you when you die if you are alone. If you, for whatever reason, have no family members or don't want them with you, there is someone who will come and hold your hand. And you can volunteer for this as well.
That's nice.
I think that's a wonderful call to action, actually, for our listeners. Obviously, if you're going through something, but I think if you're looking for a way to volunteer, that's probably, maybe sounds morbid, but one of the greatest gifts you could ever give somebody, right, is to be beside them and make sure that they don't leave the world alone.
In particular, if you come from a country that maybe has some other immigrants here, that maybe in their last moments they want to be with someone who can speak their language and take them into the next world. If you could volunteer for that, that would be a great comfort for them.
Absolutely. So, Katie, I mean, you mentioned you don't feel like it's easy for Danes to talk anyway, but maybe particularly not about salaries. I don't think that's unique at all to Denmark. But Kay, I think you come from a different continent. How does that kind of reflect your own experience, either there or here?
Well, Americans love to talk about money. We like money. But I want to point out that there is actually a forum on Reddit called Deko Lønseddel, or Denmark Payslip, where people share their salary slips. It has 76,000 users. So you can see what a pedagogue makes, what a software engineer makes, what a nurse makes, what a zookeepers make. Zookeepers do not make very much money, I learned. It's fascinating to compare and have people talk, and people will actually request, if they're thinking about maybe working, let's say, at Novo. Can I see a salary slip from a Novo person at this level or whatever? Of course, people black out their personal information. But I love this transparency because you can see, first of all, a lot of the inequality developing in Denmark. The software engineer makes a lot more money than the nurse. And just the transparency, I think, is a good idea.
I completely agree with you. I kind of have it as a personal rule to myself that I always want to be transparent with my colleagues in work about what I make, because I don't think it's either anything to be embarrassed about, or, I don't think it helps anybody except the HR department keep costs down if I do. And I would rather help my good colleagues. And actually, in the last 2-3 jobs that I've worked, being open about that and just having, conversations around it, I've seen colleagues then step up and say, okay, but then I feel like I should be paid more, and get it. So I would definitely encourage people as well, have those conversations, and they don't have to be, transparent does not necessarily mean in public in front of the entire company, but have those coffee breaks, be open with that and help your colleagues get the pay they deserve.
As a man, I am very happy that you are doing that, Fionn, because I think too many women in particular are afraid to talk about money, and then they don't get what they deserve. So I love the fact that as a man, you're transparent, you say how much you're getting, and then the other colleagues, whatever they identify as, can go after what they feel they deserve.
Absolutely. That's probably the part I left unspoken in that, but I think it particularly helps female colleagues, it helps younger colleagues, and I think it also really helps international colleagues as well. So I think with that, we are probably getting towards the time where we need to wrap up this episode. It's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. So thank you so much to Katie and to Kay. Kay, I would love if you could just tell our audience where people can find your podcast and, of course, where they can buy your new book, The Danish Year, 12 Months of Customs, Quirks, and Rhythms of Everyday Life.
You can find the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, Google Podcasts. It's absolutely everywhere. The book itself is exclusive to Amazon Kindle, and it only costs 35 crowns. So I think it fits just about everybody's budget.
That's wonderful. And I think it's definitely something that I'll be checking out. I mean, I've been here for 6-7 years, and I always encounter more quirks to Danish life that I was not aware of. And they always take me by surprise. And they always take me back to the first time visiting Denmark and seeing a Sankt Hans effigy of a witch burning in my nephew's Bernahale, and all these little 4-year-olds dancing around burning a witch. It was quite the culture shock.
Isn't that amazing? And what's so amazing about the burning of the witch is that's not an old tradition. That's from the 1920s. You would think that was something in the 1600s. No, that's actually fairly new. I do not like that particular tradition. I like a lot of traditions in Denmark. I don't like that one.
I like all the bread. There's a lot of bread in the traditions.
You're absolutely right, Katie. There's a lot of good bread.
And that's bread of life. But that is where we will leave it today. I think ultimately, and this doesn't sound too faux deep, but I think we had 3 stories kind of about transitions. Obviously, buildings changing purpose and maybe revitalizing parts of rural life, or giving the options to change parts of rural life. Obviously, roads changing prices, but I think there's a conversation there about how we actually maybe 1, transition to a greener society, but 2, make sure that people aren't left behind in doing that we can't just look at the cores of big cities and say that we've solved every public transport problem. And of course, I think the last is changing how people talk about difficult subjects, death and salaries. So very different topics, but I think similar, bigger questions underneath. How do we make room for different ways of living without losing the things that we already have? With that said, thank you so much from me. Thank you to all of our team behind the scenes who make this podcast happen. And we will see you next week in Denmark.